Hi, I'm Sarah from The Upcoming. A pleasure to have you here with us in London. Maybe you could begin with a brief introduction to this fascinating documentary, Never Look Away. What can people expect when they watch it?
Well, thank you, Sarah. I'm Lucy Lawless, and many people know me as the Warrior Princess, but I just played one on TV, and I made a film about a real life warrior princess. She was a New Zealand camerawoman who shows up in 1980s Texas and can remember nothing about her past except this is her job. And she embarks on an odyssey of sex and drugs and punk music and thrill seeking, and finally gets a job with fledgling network CNN and goes off to war and discovers this new drug, which is the drug of war. And from living a life of complete hedonism through horrible trauma, she walks on the side of the angels eventually, lives a life of service. So it's about this kind of the hunt for what enabled this woman to survive the trauma of having her lower face blown off by a sniper in the siege of Sarajevo, and just learning how you can not only survive but thrive and reach your potential. That's kind of the lesson of Margaret Moth.
And obviously, after so many years being in front of the camera, what first sparked the idea for you to step behind it? And of all the things I guess you could have made a film about, why this subject?
I never intended to direct, never. Even 2 weeks after responding to the email saying, do you want to make a film about my best friend, Margaret Moth, I still had no intention of directing. And I was just seized by this incredible passion. It was like Margaret used me to tell her own story. It wasn't a conscious choice. I was just possessed by it. And then eventually we were going, who are we going to get to direct this? And somebody said, why don't you? And I thought, don't be silly, I've never directed. And I was like, wait a minute, nobody cares about this in the way that I do. So yes, I should direct. And still, I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I'm a pretty dogged person, it turns out. And I learned a lot about myself and about reaching your potential through this process. And I really thank Margaret and her best friend, Jo Duran, who bought me the project in the first place.
And what I think is amazing about the doc is that almost like the form of it itself seems to reflect a lot about her personality. Like you just go on such a roller coaster and so many unexpected moments, so many incredibly moving moments. Where on earth do you begin, especially if you don't have direct access to your subject? What did you start with? I mean, you've got all the archival footage, you've got the talking head interviews. What was your starting point in terms of research, and how did you envision it in your head to begin with?
First of all, I started talking to her friends and lovers and eventually her family. I was really on the hunt for who is this woman, because everything I heard was so polarized from every other thing. She's a bundle of contradictions. For example, she had a terror of moths when she was a child. So when she changed her name by deed poll to Margaret Moth, that was a surprise in itself. It was really about the plane that she used to drop out of with her parachute. Like, she's a major thrill seeker, right? But anyway, it was a real hunt to understand this woman, and she's sort of unknowable in a way, and yet very compelling and weirdly inspirational. So I hope you're going to come away from this going, if that woman did so much when so much had been ripped away from her violently, who am I not to succeed? Who am I not to be beautiful, successful, have the love in my life or whatever? She's a real inspiration.
And what I love about it as well is you sort of don't shy away from any of the sort of messy bits, like you say, her contradictions. And
I
messy
love
bits
the messy bits. Are you kidding?
And like the fact that she was just this pure headiness, even just the way she looked, so punk rock. I think it was like 24/7 she looked rock and roll. The fact that she was, dabbling in drugs and booze and taking lovers, but at the same time doing this incredibly serious job of being there on the front line in these war zones. Was that something that you really wanted to capture and kind of not sort of varnish over any of those bits?
I love the messy bits of humanity. That's what binds us together. And in acknowledging, as she did in her life, all the light and shadow in herself, that's what gives us permission to admit to ourselves who we are. She wasn't afraid to tell even her mother about her sexual adventures or her drug taking or whatever. She was very honest about that, yet in other ways, a complete mystery from one person to the other. They didn't all know every side of her. In fact, I'm positive that her colleagues are quite surprised by this film, because if her work life was dangerous, her private life was even more perilous. Yeah, she was a wild character.
And in that sense, when you were conducting these interviews, I mean, there were a few moments where I was like, oh, goodness, did you feel the same? Like some of and because they're so candid, the way they're speaking to you, like, without any kind of filter really, and just in a very honest, raw way. Was there any moment where you sort of gasped?
Oh, there were times when I felt a bit judgy about some of the stuff with Margaret. I was worried that, she had had possibly a malign influence on her young lover, Jeff, who starts the story. But he died shockingly at Christmas, and he never got to see the film, but he was my very special collaborator in this process, Jeff. And I asked his brother, do you blame Margaret in some way for his drug taking and his addictions and all that? And he said, absolutely not. Margaret actually slowed it down. And if anything, I was kind of relieved, because I didn't know, which is to say, I wasn't sure, sometimes how I felt about her. But in the end, she lived a life of great worth and great service to the children, the non-combatants of war, who she lived to tell their stories. And another beautiful outcome of this film is that the audiences say to me, I never thought about the cost of news gathering before, because these people are facing indescribable pressures and dangers today, as you and I sit here, and as people are listening to this. It's happening in Ukraine, in Gaza, in countries in Africa. There's a lot of conflicts going on around the world, and these journalists on the front line have no self-interest in telling those stories, but they believe in the value of their job. Because if nobody reports it, if there's an atrocity, the perpetrators can say never even happened. So they're crucial to a civil society, truth tellers.
And I guess that's the other layer to this documentary, because you're not only kind of building a portrait of Margaret, but it's also delving into the very concept of photojournalism, war journalism. I was thinking actually of Alex Garland's Civil War, which is sort of interrogating, in a similar space. Seeing that footage and also thinking about the fact that she was a woman operating in this incredibly male-dominated environment, and she sort of never made a thing about that. She just got on and did it. And even then after her injury, she was completely unfazed by that. So I think it is almost a tribute to the importance of that and to these amazing people who are brave enough to do it.
Yeah, I'm really passionate about defending those people on the front lines, because there's so much mud being slung at mainstream media. And while I can't speak to what news networks do, whether they're, arms of propaganda for some political force or other, is not the point I'm making. It's that those people on the front lines gathering those interviews have no self-interest. They are trauma bonded to the job, trauma bonded to their role in bringing the truth to us about what's going on in the world, speaking for the innocent victims of war.
And did you feel like, in a strange way, it almost felt even more timely, knowing what's going on in Gaza right now? I mean, some of those images, obviously it's like a completely different time period that it's focusing on. It just feels like it couldn't be any more relevant. So do you think it's almost like come into its own, making sure that we do realise the importance of this kind of really accurate reporting, and we need these media players to be there on the front line? We can't just trust what we see online all the time.
Yeah, I mean, the journalists on the ground that are shooting these images, like Margaret, are showing the bottom of the cliff stuff. We're not saying what the forces are that create. I mean, that's hard for them. You can't always tell what the forces are behind that. That's for the investigative journalists. But the people who are capturing the images are showing the power, the story and the faces of the innocent, the powerless. And that's who they live for. That's who Margaret lived for, was the children of war, who through no fault of their own are facing homelessness, displacement, being maimed themselves. So nobody could relate to that better than Margaret, who herself had had her jaw blown off, lost her teeth, her tongue, her beauty, her speech, her standing in the community, possibly her career, but through sheer force of nature, fought back and lived a life entirely of service to those children of war. She who had had her tubes tied, never wanted to have kids, found her children.
And in terms of the takeaways from the documentary, I guess they are so multi-layered, you know, as we've said about the importance of war journalism, but there's also something very universal just about that message she had. I mean, you know, don't be boring, no regrets, but also living life to the fullest. And the fact that she was a woman sort of blazing this trail, and it makes you, I think, you reflect, oh, well, God, well, what will my legacy be? You know, what are the things that I need to just throw caution to the wind and get on and do? So I think a lot of people can sort of take that out of the cinema too.
I'm really surprised to hear you say legacy. I always think that's such a man's thing, is to have legacy and offspring and leave a mark. And I'm not sure that Margaret thought that way. I think it's about eating life while you have it. And as long as she wasn't dead, she was going to keep sucking the marrow out of her every day and enjoying as much and adding value where she could. I think that's the message.
And what did it mean to you, I guess, to first have the film in Sundance and then be able to bring it to London, for Sundance London, to, you know, to a British audience? And did you see any difference in the reaction? Has it been a real conversation starter?
I could not be more surprised to find myself in this position, because I was really just making the film, A, for myself, to please myself, B, for New Zealanders, to see one of their own. And the world has kind of grabbed it and loving it. And it's made my career go at a 90-degree angle. And I didn't see that coming. And now I'm completely hooked. And now I'm developing other projects, because I don't think I can go back to just being an actor now.
And what do you think would be next? Would you stick with documentary? Would you go into fiction? Would you star in something you were directing?
I'm not looking at starring something I'm directing. I'm not even thinking about that. I'm developing scripts, one from a graphic novel with the graphic artist herself, and another one with an author in Italy, a trilogy of books that he has. Another one with a Kiwi. So I've got 3 projects at different stages of development. But you know, you never know what's going to find funding. So I'm not a gun for hire. I'm always going to develop my own stuff, because only then do I know that I have that special feeling where I can obsess on this 24/7 for as long as it takes. Yeah, it's quite a commitment.
And going back to what, you know, the way Margaret said, she never made a thing about being a woman doing something. But do you reflect on the fact that actually it's only recently we are seeing more female-directed films, particularly in the documentary arena, and maybe that is opening up space to have more portraits of women and explore the female experience on screen, and that maybe it might have been a bit ignored in the past?
I think there is definitely, obviously, women are getting much more opportunity now. There's people are actually opening doors, not at a furious rate, I will say. It's still a miracle to get anything funded. But moreover, that women look at things in a different way. So, and by the way, men can have the female gaze too. For example, an old Jimmy Cagney movie is the male gaze, quote unquote, whereas in my opinion, The Godfather is the female gaze, because they're not interested in the who, what, where. Like journalism is male gaze. It's concrete thinking. It's about motivations, and it's about the subterranean, and it's about the how and why. That's what we call the female gaze. And you can reinvestigate, relitigate old ideas in a new way. And so that opens up a world of a new kind of filmmaking.
And finally, you know, in terms of going through this experience, where it was the first time making a film, what do you think was the hardest part of it? What was the best bit, and what will you take to your next project?
The best bit was just loving my interview subjects. I love human beings. I love us, warts and all. I don't want to shy away from that ever. And I want to make entertainment. I'm not so interested in being highbrow. I want to entertain. And the thing that I will take away from it is the lesson of Margaret about I'm changed through this process because she made me reach a potential I didn't even know I had. And now I'm like, whoa, sky's the limit. Now I'm filled with a whole new kind of ambition and a new certitude, I think, and a new calmness about myself. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all that with me.
My
Huge
pleasure.
congratulations
Thank you.
on the project and best of luck with all these future ones. Can't wait to see what you do next. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.